Ashi. I'm the program manager of EDTU. Together with me today, we have Stefan Möllerman, also from EDTU, George Ubax, the president, the managing director, the vice president of EDTU, Liz Marr, and the other colleagues are sticking around too. So I'm gonna, for those of you that are not here, in particular, some of the panelists didn't have the chance to be here the first today, I'm gonna give you a short summary of what happened. So on the first day, we had the kickoff from Professor Mark Brown from DCU, where he's a chair in digital learning, who actually used a metaphor of the microscope, and he put the literature under the microscope, providing several insights, critical observation, and major takeaways on the growth of microcredential movement. Then we had the Dr. Lynn Ramsey, who's also one of our panelists, that based on the experience of Microcred, the project Microcred, presented the progress and creation of a national, so Irish, framework for microcredential. The third presenter was George Ubax, our EDTU manager director, who also underlined the work done in the relation to the generation of the common microcredential framework developed within EMC and EMCLM projects, and also some guideline insights on the design of microcredential based on the work done also with the project ESLP. The second day was then more focused on the implementation of a microcredential, and we had the senior advisor in international affairs and Una Europa operational lead at the University of Helsinki, Dr. Maija Urponen, who focused on a microcredential called also from them microqualification sustainability development within the Una Europa University Alliance. Then we had a video presentation from Dr. Francisco Iniesto, who is a research assistant also at the Open University UK, who introduced the model and guideline for the assessment and recognition of microcredential developed within the EDTU coordinated project EMCLM. Also from UK was our third speaker in the second day, Director of Learning at the MOOC platform Future Learn, Matt Jenner, who presented what he called the story so far on microcredential from Future Learn, sharing the challenge and the highlight of this process, this experience. Last but not least was then Professor Frederick Trowen from the Catholic University of Leuven, who presented the key step lesson learned in designing short microcredential and short learning program. All the presentations done so far in this webinar are available on our EDTU SlideShare, and will be also shown on our website, the link at least. So I leave now the floor to the moderator of the panel day, that is Liz Marr. I leave you the floor, Liz.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Alessandra, for that excellent summary of the previous 2 days. Sounds like it's been really full on and really informative. And I'm just sorry that I haven't been able to get to any of the sessions, but I'll definitely be looking at the recordings. So we've got a lovely panel for you this morning, and we're going to ask each of the panelists in turn to speak for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to open it up for a conversation and for questions. So if you do have questions that come up, pop them into the chat or save them for the last half an hour or so of the session, and we'll come to you then. So I'm not going to give the full biographies of all our speakers in the interest of time, but I want just to welcome Lynn Ramsey. Lynn is the program lead for multi-campus micro-credential project at the Irish Universities Association, and she's going to speak for 10 minutes to introduce her thoughts here. So over to you, Lynn.
Thank you very much, Liz, and good morning to everyone from Donegal in Ireland. I'll just get this into slide mode. See that okay? Yeah,
Just quite in slide mode yet, Lynn.
yeah, I'm just trying to push it over. Sorry, the bit stopped at the top of my screen. Apologies. Okay, there.
That's it.
Thank you very much. So pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to EA2 for inviting me to join with you again. It's been a really interesting week. So I've been thinking a lot about the questions that we were set as our kind of homework. And I've been thinking about them when I've been walking the dog, and I've been thinking about them when I've been going to the shop. So they kind of played about in my head a lot. And I thought they were really captured the essence of the work that we're doing. And I thought they all fed into a kind of flip of that. And it was kind of what could go well. I know as academics, we're very measured and considered and think a lot about the pitfalls, but I think we have a great opportunity with microcredentials to realize their potential as a disruptor, particularly if they focus on the reasons why we're motivated to be engaged in the development of microcredentials. And we have great opportunity when we have a great group of colleagues, as we have in sessions like this, to really interrogate those building blocks of what success for microcredentials could look like. So for me, I was thinking about what could go well in terms of the learner experience, what could go well in terms of our engagement around enterprise, civil society partners, and also what could go well for universities in terms of how we do our business and what's important to us. So first and foremost, I thought about these under three categories. And for me, a successful journey through microcredentials would be that we would land on a point where microcredentials were embedded in our systems, embedded within our ecosystems for credentials and awards, embedded within our quality assurance systems, within our student record systems, within our admissions process, and really embedded within our culture and language, so that we might come to a point where we would lose the language of alternative or non-major awards or second chance pathways, that we might, in the same way that we don't talk about undergraduate bachelor programs as non-postgraduate programs, that we would just think about this as core business, and that we would embed it within our funding systems, on the premise that a student is a student is a student. And so in this way, we need to think very carefully, I think, about all of those aspects. So when we look about quality assurance within the context of these smaller credentials and smaller awards, we really need to be confident that we are stress testing our existing systems, not trying to shoehorn in much more agile and flexible provision within our existing conceptions of what a gold standard for quality assurance is, for example. When we think about our student record systems, we need to find a mainstreaming way of managing these shorter qualifications and credentials, both as learners come to us in one institution or as learners journey across multiple institutions, as we all inevitably do over our course of professional development. And we also need to think creatively around our admissions processes and what it means to join, in particular, postgraduate micro-credentials pieces. So what are we thinking about in terms of pre-qualification? What are we thinking about how people might evidence that? How informed are we allowing our learners to be, or potential learners to be, about the suitability of these short programs for them? Are they well set up to succeed in those programs? So those are really interesting questions, I think, that we have to start to unpick if we want the successful outcome to be that these are embedded. And of course, central to all of that will be that whole policy piece, that we don't have workarounds for all of that within our system. And by policy, I mean policy not just at an institutional level, but at a transnational level also. So the third element that I was thinking about, that would be a measure of success, would be the success to which our micro-credentials work was truly collaborative. I thought the question, who else needs to be involved, was a really great one. We just did an interesting piece in Ireland around our next steps in higher education for teaching and learning. And one of our key speakers there talked about how we value teaching and learning, and considered that it was fundamental that we didn't just talk amongst ourselves about what that value meant. And we have a habit sometimes in academia to have very interesting and very detailed conversations with ourselves, but we forget about who else needs to be involved in those conversations, and not just involved in the conversations, involved really as collaborative partners. So if we think about the value of micro-credentials, we need to understand that from multiple perspectives. So we need to think about who our learners are. We spoke about this at the IATU conference a couple of weeks back, and we've thought really deeply and engaged in lots of different ways to try and understand who the learners for micro-credentials might be. We need to think about what the motivations for these learners are in terms of engaging in this type of lifelong learning. And we also need to start unpicking what they might want beyond the individual learning outcomes of the micro-credential itself. So what would a student experience be like for a micro-credentials learner? We've started to explore ourselves what the student services side of the house might look like from a micro-credentials learner's perspective. But I think there's other pieces there that we probably don't realize the value of what we have. So those access to university networks that come to you if you engage in university provision, access to library, absolutely. I think crucially access to career guidance, but structured for the micro-credential learners. So there's a lot to think about there. Equally, we need to think about collaboration with enterprise, understanding their needs and their priorities, particularly if they're going to support learners coming on stream, if the micro-credentials are going to address the challenge presented to us in terms of upskilling and reskilling. And we need to really engage with government and supranational agencies if this is to become mainstream provision, if we're really to bring about a transformation and lifelong learning. And then we need to be critical and engage in a research active way around all of this thing, and not just assume that it's going to be a good thing because we wish it to be so. So really thinking about the evidence base that will feed and underpin that collaboration. Do we track these micro-credentials learners in terms of success, just in terms of completion? Do we track the impact of the learning experience as they move on through their professional journeys? And Mark Brown gave us a really interesting insight earlier this week in terms of where the literature is at. And then the final element that I thought would be a measure of success would be if we realize the transformative potential of micro-credentials. We're very involved in conversations, as I assume you all are, around the learner autonomy within the conception of a micro-credential, and the ability for the learner to learn at their own pace and potentially stack towards a larger award. And those larger awards could be within your institutions or across institutions. And in order for that learner autonomy to be realized, then we need to really be actively thinking about all of the questions around that, including how we provide pathways that are clear to the learner and support the learner in their journeys. I think also we would, if we were successful, we would have gone some way to realizing the value of micro-credentials when the conception of the universities, the European Universities Association, and the whole move to universities without walls, and allowing students to move in a fluid way. I think there's rich learning. And I think one of the other transformational potentialities is in the teaching and learning space. We heard across this week, and I'm sure you're seeing in your practice, really new ways of thinking about teaching and learning that are emerging through micro-credentials. And for me, there's a great potential for the micro-credentials to be sites of innovation in terms of how we do things, to allow us a little bit of space to take some risks, to try things that are a little bit unusual, to really partner in a meaningful way with learners and enterprise, and create these safe but collaborative and dynamic spaces where learners, enterprise, and academics can come together to think deeply and really engage in an impactful way in response to that upskilling and reskilling agenda, and indeed in response to the global society's challenges agenda. So those are my thoughts, and really interested to hear the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. That's a great start. And I just put in the chat, I love that last slide. The image was beautiful, but very nice summary. Thank you very much for that. And hopefully we'll get quite a few questions in the discussion later. I'm going to move us on now and introduce Deborah Arnold. So Deborah is, amongst other things, coordinator of an Erasmus Plus project, ECHO, I hope I'm saying that correctly, which is focused on fostering the uptake of digital credentials. So I'm going to hand straight over to Deborah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Liz, can you see my slide correctly?
I think you need to put them in.
We see the presenter mode.
Yeah.
Can you see it properly now?
Yeah,
yes.
Okay, I never know which screen they're on. Okay, thank you very much for that, and it was great to hear Lynn's approach as well, because I think most of us are pretty well aligned with the way we see things. I didn't take the questions one by one, but I think we can use them to consider some of the different angles that I've taken on this. The Erasmus Plus project ECHO, which is the European credit or credential clearinghouse for opening up education, of which EADTU is also a key partner. Looking at perhaps some of the things that might go wrong is this lack of agreement on what we're talking about when we use the word micro-credentials. And also in the different languages, we've had trouble in France coming to agreement on what the term is. We hear micro-qualification. I've just seen micro-accreditation. And we know that the term is being used to refer to the courses themselves, to the certificates, and I think what we need is to get some clarity in terms of the definitions. But then, as Lynn said, in higher education, we spend a lot of time talking amongst ourselves, and we've also got to get beyond this stage of just talking about the definitions and looking further into the actual usefulness of these micro-credentials. So as just two examples, here we've got micro-credentials presented as the courses themselves, which lead to the credential as the certificate. And then if you look at some of the definitions that we're beginning to see, on the one hand from the European Commission, and on the other from Beverly Oliver's work with UNESCO, we've got the real focus on the proof of learning outcomes, the record of learning achievement. So it does seem as if the official definitions are tending towards micro-credential as the artifact, the record of learning itself. But then from a marketing point of view for higher education institutions and consortia, micro-credential will obviously continue to be used as a term for what we call the learning opportunity itself. In terms of where things might go, and also in terms of who might be or who should be involved, and I was thinking of this in terms of scenarios specifically for continuing education, taking us beyond that internal higher education institution focus. So for example, the first scenario is where a micro-credential could be used as a way of accessing a profession. We already have professional certifications, taking those and formalizing those in some kind of digital credential form to give much more visibility to the competences and the evaluation and assessment of those competences would be one scenario. Obviously, micro-credentials as individual blocks in terms of lifelong learning and upskilling, and particularly in France, this is a challenge for higher education, where there is still very much focused on the core business of the diploma, but there's much work going on at the moment in terms of developing a micro-credential offering in this form. And the scenario I like best, and I think this also relates to what Lynn said earlier about bringing all the stakeholders around the table and this co-construction, co-design to meet labour market needs and societal needs. And this, there are actually concrete examples of this scenario that I've seen in the US in particular, where based on the employment needs in a particular region, the companies, the universities and association and the learners and citizens themselves came together to reverse engineer micro-credentials in both forms. So in the form of the learning opportunity, the course itself, and in the form of the certificate, to meet those needs. And it was transformative. The employers actually changed the way they wrote their job descriptions to encourage people to apply for those jobs, and the universities and associations built micro-credentials to meet those needs, and it had an impact on employment, especially amongst disadvantaged populations in that particular region. So I think that's definitely a model that would be well worth exploring further. And then, of course, there's the whole let's say technicality, the technical aspect, especially when you're looking at micro-credentials in their digital credential form. And it's how do we actually build them, and how do we design them, and how do we issue them to learners? This is a shameless plug. Why am I not moving on here? For an event that we're running with EADTU next week, next Tuesday, in fact, where we'll be looking in detail about how to use the European Digital Credentials for Learning infrastructure to go from a course description to a credential description, and to actually issue these verified, authenticated credentials to learners. So you've got the URL there, and we hope to see lots of people join us for that. And we'll be there with George Ubax and Alessandra and Stefan from EADTU as well. So that's really my take on this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And on the policy side, I'm just going to share in the chat the Madrid micro-credential statement that we drew up with Mark Brown, with Tim Reed from UNED and others as part of the last Eden conference in June. So do take a look at that, because that covers as well some of these policy aspects and the way forward that's needed. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Again, really helpful, interesting summary of thinking. I think what's coming across is real passion for this subject from both you and Lynn, which is really nice to see, especially as I'm somebody who's also passionate about the opportunities here. So really great, thank you. Our next speaker, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is Jan-Mael Bido. Do we have Jan-Mael here?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. Did I say your name correctly, first of all?
Yes, it's Jan-Mael.
Thank you. So Jan-Mael is Policy Officer at the European Commission, and amongst other things, focusing on a proposal for a European approach to micro-credentials. So the floor is yours, Jan-Mael.
Thank you very much. I will ask you to apologize for the poorness of my PowerPoint presentation after the beautiful slides I have seen so far, and for my presentation that will be probably a bit drier than the ones you have been used to in the last days. I'm really sad I couldn't attend all the discussion. Unfortunately, as you know, we are putting together the last adaptations for the European approach to micro-credentials that will be hopefully adopted toward the end of the year, where we try to address some of the questions and points that were raised. Lynn talked about ecosystems for microcredential and embedding them into the education training systems. This is something that we'll try to address in our recommendation. And Deborah raised some very important points about the need for a definition, which will be central in the proposal we will put forward, and the translation issues that are actually very, very important points we have to deal now, because agreeing on what microcredential is in English doesn't imply it's clear in every other language. So in my presentation, I'll just brush on some of the points that some of the questions you sent earlier. At first, a small a reminder of why we're working on this and what is the policy challenge linked to microcredentials. From the EU point of view, we see that there is a growing number of people who need to update their knowledge, their skills, their competencies. The ways of learning, of teaching are changing. And we think that microcredentials have quite some potential to play in this, and they can provide to be a very useful way of updating the knowledge and skills of people, whether it is for labor market or for personal development or for further studies. But in order to be as efficient and to benefit the largest number of people as possible, we need first to agree on what microcredentials are and ensure that we have a common understanding around what microcredentials are. And we see that it's not only a problem at EU level, it's also sometimes at a problem at national level. It's between sectors. There's sometimes different understanding. And this is really a problem for microcredentials and the potential they can have. We want a European approach to microcredentials that would that could be applied to a diverse range of providers. It's not only universities who can provide microcredentials, and they're already out there. They are provided by private companies, NGOs, or in cooperation between universities and private providers. So there is a wide diversity of practices around microcredentials as well, and we need to take that into account. And of course, different practices raise even more question on the quality, on the transparency of microcredentials and what they represent. So as you know, during and preparing the proposal for recommendation on microcredentials, we had long consultations with different stakeholders. It was member states, universities, employers, social partners, etc. And we see from the key messages that something to be very clear is that microcredentials should not have the effect to replace traditional qualifications, because that is seen to be as a danger, notably by traditional education providers like university, that microcredential would kind of disrupt the holistic approach to education if we were to adopt an approach that would allow, for example, to combine microcredentials into full degrees in a way that would not be controlled by the authorities who usually deliver degrees, for example. So governments agree that, and it's very clear for us as well, that microcredentials should not replace traditional qualification. They are here to complement traditional qualification. They are here eventually to support the access to traditional qualifications, like to enter higher education, for example, or to have a transition from secondary education to tertiary education. Flexibility is one of the key strengths of microcredential. This is what in a way, define them, and we should avoid to over-regulate this field, because otherwise we risk to kill innovation and kill the principle and the essence of microcredentials. But they are very useful. There's a huge potential to align people skill set with labor market needs by offering them more targeted offer that is easier to develop, quicker to develop, maybe. And that can be also accessible to a wider range of people, because not everyone has the capacity or the possibility, because of time constraints, because of life constraints, to register into a full qualification and dedicate a year, 2 years into a full education. So microcredentials can provide, in a way, an alternative path that is not comparable to a full degree, but that can allow people to at least build a learning pathway. There is quite some disagreement among national governments whether microcredentials should be incorporated into the national qualification frameworks or not. Some countries have already done it. Some countries are more reluctant to do it. And whether the microcredentials should be linked to ECTS, to credits. And yes, the national qualification framework was seen as probably the most sensitive point in the consultation. To give you a small teaser of what will be in the proposal, of course, I cannot tell you exactly what's going to be in the proposal until the Commission has voted and to adopt the proposal. But the way we see things is that we will try to tackle the first bigger problem. We have a common definition of microcredentials. To clarify the matter, what are microcredentials? We put the definition for consultation earlier this year. The result of the consultation showed that the elements we put forward were quite well received. So the definition, I think I can say without any surprise, will look not so different from the one that was put in the consultation. It won't be exactly the same, but it will be a bit different. But only a bit. Then we'll put forward standards element, meaning basically what kind of information should be in a microcredential, what kind of information the microcredential should contain, like the name of the person who holds the microcredential, the organization that has issued it, etc., etc. We will also propose some key principles for the design and issuance of microcredentials. This will supposed to serve more as support and guideline for providers and member states to develop microcredential offer that is of good quality, that is consistent, that respects some quality, some transparency principles, among other principles. And then we will put forward some more recommendations to the member states to develop an ecosystem for microcredentials, where microcredentials can be developed and used. A recommendation to member states to use microcredentials. Microcredentials can be used for very diverse reasons, and we will put forward some recommendation that will not limit, of course, the use of microcredentials to those areas, but just to give indications to member states, and recommendations to the Commission to support the member states in developing this offer and in ensuring that they have a consistent approach across the EU. So these are the information I can share with you at the moment. And this is where I will stop my presentation, but I'm looking forward to the questions and discussion afterward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Mal. Can I just ask you a quick question? What are the timeframes for that? So roughly when would you be expecting to recommend to the Commission? Well,
the Commission is has planned to adopt this proposal for the early December, for the first weeks of December. But then it's the Commission adopting a proposal to the Council. So then the Council has to first agree on the proposal and adopt it itself. We hear that the French presidency is interested in the topic and they would like to take up this proposal. And so we can expect it to have it adopted in the first half of next year. But because the French presidency will be a very busy one on the field of education, if there's no time for microcredentials, then we heard that the Czech presidency that will follow is also very keen on seeing this proposal adopted. So I think 2022 is a safe time frame.
That's great. Thank you very much. That's really encouraging. So thanks, Jan-Mael. Okay, we're going to move on to our final speaker. And this is, sorry, my notes, Janica Lokov, who is a Senior Policy Officer at NFIC, amongst many other things, and working on streamlining recognition practices across Europe. So I'm going to hand over to Janica.
Yes, thank you, Liz, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And I will give a perspective from the recognition of foreign qualifications. And I actually had to, I had an insight laugh when Jan-Mael said, my presentation will be a bit drier and my PowerPoint will be shorter because I have no PowerPoint and recognition is usually perceived as a rather dry topic. So anyways, I will try to make it lively. And I would like to start with, well, the opportunity before going into what we see as areas of improvement. So the opportunities of micro-credentials and standalone e-learning, as which was actually where we started to explore the question. Our basic concern is how can we bring these learning experiences from learners into our evaluation? So if we have an applicant and who shows up with this type of learning, how can we include this? And of course, the whole framework for credential evaluation and the recognition of foreign qualifications is based on whole qualifications. And I mean, in the past, we sometimes had students showing up with like papers showing that they did a course. So or other learning certificates. But we saw a few years ago that with the rise of MOOCs and standalone e-learning got a new push. So we started to look at it again, and we conducted a few projects on this. So the basic question for us is, how can we bring this type of learning? How can we bring it in as part of our evaluation? And so it can be used for access to higher education in the labor market. So we started to explore this in 2016. And since we've coordinated a series of projects, so NAFIC coordinated a series of projects together with our sister ENIC-NARICS. So an ENIC-NARIC, for those who are not familiar, is a national information center on academic recognition, tasked to support fair recognition in their country. So there are worldwide 57 centers. So we explored this with a group of ENIC-NARICS and other stakeholders, also including EADTU. And our initial focus was on standalone e-learning and how we can bring this in. And so in the first project, we were very much focused on the methodology to see if the framework we had could also be applied on this type of learning. And the good news was that, yes, we can use this framework. But this didn't mean that we could just evaluate or easily recognize the type of learning that landed on our desk. And also to give maybe a perspective, we do not get a lot of standalone e-learning or micro-credentials on our desk at this moment. Just to give that as a perspective. But the things, and I will make this very brief, but the things we see as the biggest parts of improvements and which are the biggest obstacles for us, and these are very practical ones, the first is information provision. And this is also related when I just heard that there will be standard elements being promoted by in a proposal. That would be really, really helpful, because we see that information on the micro-credential or the standalone courses is not always provided and not always provided in a way that it connects to the standards we're using, which brings to the next point. The second one is that we would recommend for providers to use the Bologna tools, and we do see, of course, a lot. Not all the providers are in the Bologna context, but this would be very helpful. The third point is the quality assurance of e-learning. That's perhaps the biggest issue. And here also the current instruments could be very helpful. And the third one, it's connected with this, and that's speed. In the credential evaluation offices, so in INEC-NARIC offices, but also admissions offices at higher education institutions, the persons that are doing evaluations are under time pressure. There are high volumes of students, so there's not a lot of time to make a project to discover what is the status of this learning unit. In the current STACK project, which we're running, we're developing an app to try to speed up this process. But it's also reinforcing the earlier 2 points, that information provision and use of current tools is just very important, because that helps the speed as well. So that would be maybe, these are some very practical points, but I would like to close here my statements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janneke. So some really interesting points there. I've just been making some notes as people have been talking and pulling out some key themes. And I think if we go back to Lynn was talking about the importance of embedding and the importance of information, advice and guidance, and the necessity to see this as the policy to shift in order that micro-credential learning is not seen as a kind of workaround, but something that's part of the mainstream. And I think the reference to multiple perspectives that we need to take into consideration, but also I really like the idea of the universities without walls, which is something that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. But having the space for people to take risks is really important. In Deborah's presentation, she talked about getting beyond the idea of what, talking about what micro-credentials are, to focus on their usefulness, and perhaps to move on from thinking about the micro-credentials as artifacts, as records of learning, to see them as being something that's of use, and with a real focus on how we design, build and issue micro-credentials. And Jan Mael talked about the policy challenge again, so I think that's a common theme that's coming out, talked about the value and understanding, and about quality, transparency and uptake. And I think quality has come up in all four speakers' opening remarks. I particularly like that point that over-regulation can kill innovation, and that's something that we all face very often. And there was a key point around credit, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. And then Janneke talked to us about the our tendency to have recognition based on whole qualifications. Again, you mentioned, Janneke, the provision of information, and I think that links in with not just information for key stakeholders in organizations and employers, but also the information that we provide for learners. And I think you also mentioned quality assurance, and particularly interesting to me was that reference to speed, and the fact that those who are undertaking the role of evaluators of credit recognition are very time pressured. So I really like the idea of an app that will open that up a little bit. I think that the higher education sector everywhere in the world is considered as very slow in comparison to enterprise and business, and perhaps if we can speed some of these developments up a little bit, we'd be in a much better place in terms of take up, etc. So I'm going to throw, I'm going to invite people in the audience to ask questions, but I'm going to just pick one question to throw at my speakers to start off with, and that is, how important is the credit? How important is the academic credit, given that we're all, I think, of a shared view that micro-credentials are about upskilling and for the labour market, for entry to the labour market. Is credit vital? So anybody would like to take that up? Nobody. I'm going to pick.
No, I will. I can.
Okay, thanks, Deborah.
Okay. We had a lot of discussion about this with the ECHO partners, and one of the first things that we discussed was, well, what do academic credits in terms of ECTS, because we're working obviously in the European higher education area. What do they mean, and what actually leads to the delivery of ECTS? And then we looked at this whole shift towards competency-based learning and the description of learning outcomes through competencies. And I know that there's lots of work going on there. And so we made the link between micro-credentials as a record of competences achieved with this logic of lifelong learning as well. And so we came to the conclusion that at least in the current situation, the ECTS as a currency for supporting mobility within the higher education area is not going to go away. But we can also use, and this comes into the quality assurance side as well, we can also build on the competency frameworks at European level and at national levels to reinforce the quality of the way these credentials are described. And in fact, the two are not incompatible, because if you've got very, very detailed information about the learning achievements, about the activities, and about the assessment, the way those competencies were assessed, you can also provide information about any credits that those credentials deliver. So it's really not an either or, it's an and, but we're definitely putting the focus on alignment with competencies. And that is leading us into very, very interesting conversations with our academic partners on how we evaluate and assess competencies. And so it's taking it forward from that pedagogical side as well. There are obviously other more administrative challenges, but we think that that is a very, very promising way forward, because it's engaging with that competency conversation, which has got groundswell at the moment. And it's saying, well, it's just one step further to recognize those competencies through a detailed digital credential.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. Anybody else like to come in on that? Lynn?
I might come in as well, Liz. Thanks, and I would wholeheartedly agree with everything that Deborah has described. We've reached a similar position, and I think, interestingly, the drive has not just been from the academic community and from the universities, but from our enterprise partners also. There is a currency and understanding of what the value of ECTS means, what it means in terms of learner commitment, what it means in terms of quality of assessment of the outcomes. We often talk, when we talk to the enterprise partners, then we translate into learning hours very often and talk about what that would look like. But I think the Bologna tools and the ECTS conceptions are so well embedded within the Irish framework that the value and the currency then is a real benchmark and a standard for us. And it's really helpful in terms of the piece that Deborah and other colleagues talked about in terms of clarity of communication, in terms of what the micro-credential is. So for us, it's a cornerstone, I'd say, the ECTS values.
Thank you. And Janneke.
Yes, I can only echo these words, because it will help the recognition in the end, to have transparent, and ECTS is well known. So yeah, I can only stress this, the importance from a recognition point of view.
Thank you.
I can add that indeed ECTS can be very useful to make sure that micro-credentials are understood, comparable as well, and useful for the learners who can use them. Then it depends, of course, on the national education system, but you can very well imagine a system where a learner can combine several micro-credentials and get awarded some ECTS and use those ECTS whether for a partial or a full qualification in the end. What we see, at least for the academic world, for higher education institutions awarding ECTS, it is awarding micro-credentials. It is indeed very important that those are expressed also in ECTS in order to be used by the learner in the most efficient way. Of course, where it becomes more difficult is for the other providers who don't use ECTS. And here there may be some other systems or types of information they could use to express notional workload and make the micro-credentials they offer comparable.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's some really interesting points there. I mean, my personal position is that credit is really important. And I noticed there's a comment in the chat about fostering stackability. I think one of the common challenges we get is about the coherence of an award. So if you award credit for lots of small chunks of learning that are all on different subjects, how is that coherent as an award? Janneke.
Yes, to very briefly comment on this. Indeed, if you have ECTS, it's easier maybe to stack. But one of the things in recognition we look at is a profile of a qualification. And if you just would randomly stack, that doesn't make a qualification, just to put that out there. I know that there has been models on how you can stack developed as well, but yeah, that's important.
Yeah, thanks, Janneke. Anybody else like to come in on that stackability?
Yeah, I'd love to come in on the stackability and the coherency of the qualification piece, Liz, because it's such an interesting discussion. And of course, not really a new discussion either. So there's interesting models, say, doctorates by established published work, where the coherency is determined by looking back over your lifetime and seeing those threads coming through. So sometimes there's a story to be told that's not apparent from the outset. But I think for the majority of learners and professional learners, there is great merit in us scaffolding the pathway. So laying out the pathways to stacking into larger awards, and they needn't necessarily be full awards. I think that idea of the integrity of the existing structures is a helpful backdrop to all of this. But if we need to find ways of supporting the learners in progressing through those journeys, and that's looking at RPL systems in the way that Janneke has outlined. But also, I think it's encouraging, as we're seeing across Europe, universities to come together to lay out sensible pathways that support learners in this flexible way. So I think it's a bit of both. It's being open-minded as to where the final destination would be, and thinking of innovative ways of pulling those things together. But also I think it's about laying out some pathways. I know Yang Mao was looking to come in there as well.
I think Jan Mao wanted to come in again.
Yes, indeed. On stackability, we heard many times from different member states, from higher education institutions, that there's a fear that with adopting a common approach to microcredentials, we would impose some sort of completely free stackability of microcredentials, and a learner could take microcredentials in any field from any provider, just put them together and get the number of ECTS to get a full degree, which is of course not a position that is defended by actually anyone I am aware of. The stackability is here to support the learner to build a learning pathway. Of course, it has to be coherent, and as Janneke said, this coherence has to be considered by some authority, because the award are awarded by someone who has to say that, okay, this learning pathway is actually worth this degree. So, and this is dealt at national level. So there will be certainly no rule at European level that says learner can stack freely microcredentials into full degrees or even into partial qualification. Those they have to be recognized by the competent authority to do so. But it's important to pave the way for the learner to be able to progress in its knowledge and have this progression recognized, and to build yes, let's say alternative pathways for those who cannot spend 1 year at university because they have a child at home they have to take care of, because they don't necessarily have the financial resources to dedicate 2 years to study full time, or to those who don't necessarily need a full degree, they just need a small qualification in order to get a job or to progress in their career or to get access to higher education.
Thank you, Jan Mao. I think we're in danger of violently agreeing with one another on all of these issues. There's an interesting couple of points come up in the chat. One is about the hang on a sec, I just need to whiz back up to it, about interoperability between credit, and that prompted a thought in my mind about recognition of credit from other systems. And I'm particularly thinking about somebody who's maybe studied some microcredential or similar short courses on something like Coursera or Udemy or edX, and how we might think about that in the context of stackable awards in European universities. I don't know if anybody's had any thoughts about that. I can leave that one with you for a moment. We have a question about the cooperation between academia and the labour market. I think Alessandra, you're referring to possibly employers and about how we enable it, but also how important it is. And there's and then there's another question about whether there's a conflict between stacking standalone microcredentials and learning progression. I think we've talked a little bit about that just now, but I think there's the idea of cycles and progression through cycles is quite important. So there's a few thoughts there. And I think somebody's just picked up that question that I've raised about the pressure on universities to convert microcredits from other providers and the workload involved in that. Janneke, I was wondering, maybe I could come to you on that to say, is your app going to be going to help with things like that, with recognizing credit from elsewhere? And then I'll throw it open for general comment from others.
Thank you. No, yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, credits from elsewhere are also for for whole qualifications sometimes an issue. And I think as my colleague Bas Wegewijs put in the chat before, any information on workload is welcome. And I do think that the app actually also is including this. And also, we have been talking about credits, but almost as synonymous to ECTS. And I don't think from a recognition point of view that's necessary. we need information on the workload, and of course it's easy if it's standardized. So maybe I can stop here. I see also that George has his hand up in my.
Thank you.
I don't know if anyone sees George's hand, but yeah. Here.
Yeah, if I may, I just want to make a point that with a micro-credential, we really envisage the achievement of a certain competence in relation to a need expressed from market side, so to say. So a micro-credential is different from a single course with credits in the sense that it is preferably developed in collaboration or in alignment with the need of the market, of companies. And so by thinking about, and then I'm linking this to modularization of programs, it's not by just cutting up, breaking down a bigger program to single courses that you achieve a micro-credential. A micro-credential must have a purpose of achieving some competencies. And when you want to stack it to a bigger program, it's not a mathematical exercise. It's an exercise of finding the coherence and the extension of the competencies that are envisaged. So a micro-credential in that sense has a different position than single courses with credits.
Yeah, thanks, George. Point well made. And Lynn, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I might come in on your question around the engagement with enterprise, which I think you had raised, it picked up from the chat there, Liz, and I think it's aligned to what George was talking about there. So for us, we're looking at this in a number of ways. First of all, understanding what the data is telling us on skills gaps analysis. CEDEFOP's obviously doing some really interesting work in this space. In Ireland, we would have a national skills architecture. I'm sure you have similar in your own countries. And then what's really interesting, I think, is companies like LinkedIn and Coursera who are doing all their own skills analysis, looking at job adverts out there and linking keywords. So they're getting really granular in terms of what the skills potential is. So there's a data side to it. And then there's the whole collaboration piece and how you facilitate that and mainstream it within how you do your business. So within our program, we're experimenting using a model around enterprise engagement that we talked about on Tuesday briefly. And our initial pilot is looking at net carbon and the net carbon report, which is about to be published in Ireland next week. And then we'll bring together key decision makers from enterprise with key people in the universities to interrogate that data, to see are we understanding the same things from the data, because very often we talk a different language in universities and in academia than they do in enterprise, and then to see what the prioritization then of activities might be. There's a whole raft of things that could potentially be done, but there's some pressing things that have to be done in terms of responding to that agenda, and we hope that then those partnerships will develop out micro-credentials, but equally go on to be other sustained forms of collaboration. So we're looking at it as a whole sector approach. And then equally within the universities, of course, their own enterprise engagement models, but they're looking at them now also in the context of micro-credentials because enterprise is interested in the flexibility afforded by micro-credentials.
Thanks, Lynn. Anybody else want to come in on any of those points?
Yeah, I could just pick up on this question of workload and build on what I put in the chat. I think that we can learn a lot from what's going on around the recognition of prior learning, because at the moment in many places, potential candidates for let's say a whole diploma that they want to obtained through recognition of prior learning have to produce reams and reams and reams of documentation, of proof, and it represents a huge workload on academic staff. And obviously that's part of the quality assurance side, because if you're going to deliver a diploma to somebody who hasn't actually followed the course, then there obviously have to be those checks and balances built in. So I think that there's huge potential for micro-credentials to contribute to that. And that could actually be a time saver. And as George said, when we're focusing on the actual overall coherence of a set of competencies rather than that mathematical addition. I think that as I said before, this complementarity between the competency-based approach and the ECTS as an easily understandable currency is of really, really high value here. In terms of recognition for employers, I'd be very, very interested to know more about how employers see this question of workload and relate it to competencies. Are they looking for graduates or for people who have followed a 20-hour course or a 150-hour course, or are they looking for people who have a proven set of skills, abilities and competences? I don't have the answer, but I'd be very, very interested in learning more about work that's being done in that field.
Thank you, Deborah. So there's a plea there. I just want to, on the back of that, Deborah, just make a plug for EM2's PLA on RPL, which is lots of acronyms, but that's going to happen in January, hopefully. So watch this space for more conversation on that. You reminded me actually, Deborah, of many years ago, I worked at a different university, and they introduced a team of academics introduced a qualification in independent study, and the students were allowed to look across the university and decide what modules they wanted to study and bring these together and then negotiate a final piece of work, the kind of capstone module. And the first year that it ran, all of the students got first-class honours degrees, and the university closed it down because they said that couldn't possibly be the case. So I think there's some really interesting conceptions, challenges that we need to face within our own communities around that recognition of competency and learning and what counts. So that brings me to the question, another question that I'd like to ask panelists to think about, and that is the barriers to recognition of prior learning. And in my experience, a lot of that is to do with the barriers are to do with institutions recognizing each other's credit as being equivalent to theirs. So I wondered if anybody had experience of that or would like to comment on it. Or if I made the exam question too hard there.
I'm going to have to come in again because this is something that we're working on in ECHO, and it's a massive challenge. One of the components of the ECHO project is what we call the Model Credit Recognition Agreement or Model Credential Recognition Agreement. The language is evolving, and there we're actually working very, very closely with individual universities, also supporting the European University Alliances in doing that, because they are the perfect testing ground for such an approach. And it's really on a micro-credential basis. So it's providing all the information to both parties on a particular micro-credential, and then saying, well, based on this information we have, and again, it's part of a quality assurance process, we will accept any student who comes to us from your university with that micro-credential, and we will consider it equivalent to a part of a course or a micro-credential that we offer. There is slow take-up, but we're beginning to refine the processes and getting the conversations going. And hopefully by the end of the project, we will have between 5 and 10 of these agreements set up. But it is really a question of the 3 keywords that we have in the ECHO project are recognition, trust, and transparency. And there we're building on the trust and the transparency to reach this question of recognition. And there's still lots and lots of work to be done. But the clearer the information and the clearer the processes, the more chances we have of achieving that level of trust.
Thank you, Deborah. That's really, really helpful and important points. Jan-Mal, please.
Yes, indeed. I think Deborah said the 3 key words, which are recognition, transparency, and trust. For recognition, I think it's important that we make use of the tools we have at our disposal, the Bologna tools. They are here to support such comparability, and they can be used for micro-credentials. Transparency, we'll try to address with this proposal to have something consistent that ensures transparency of the offer. And trust, unfortunately, we cannot regulate trust. And this is something to be built upon common tools, common practices, and common ways of doing things. It's a long process. You know even better than me, but I'm quite confident that in the end we will get there. Maybe not all at once, but we'll get there.
Thank you. Lynn.
Thanks, Liz. So you asked about barriers to recognition of prior learning, and particularly barriers to recognition of prior accredited learning. And I suppose I've had experience of working within the higher education sector where they've been very progressive in terms of recognition of experiential learning, never mind accredited learning. And I think it's about that culture of trust and belief in the process and belief in the value of what's coming. So really good training for staff, as well as the policies being there, very open conversations to overcome maybe perceptions about the lack of quality. And then I think I just wanted to flag with colleagues around the table, we have a sister project to our Microcreds project, and that's a national project on recognition for prior learning. So I'll put the link in the chat to that project, but that's another project funded under our Human Capital Initiative, and they're doing very interesting work in this area. But for us, really, the approach is using the Bologna tools. We're very comfortable using that in the context of Erasmus Exchange and work with that very effectively. So there's lots of good practice that we can lean into, particularly, as Deborah said, with the European Universities Associations and seeing the interesting work that's going on there.
Thanks, Lynn. And that kind of leads into another question around micro-credentials and the fact that some micro-credentials are produced by industry bodies or by employers. They don't have credit. The extent to which you're talking there about experiential or kind of non-accredited prior learning, Lynn, but there's how can we, and is it desirable to recognise the credit that's or to recognise learning that's been undertaken in a micro-credential produced by a business or an organisation or an employer? Could we, George?
Yeah, so, I think I was just thinking of extending the list of Deborah by once again recognition, transparency, and trust, by also quality and relevance. And I think when you look at the what you are now mentioning, the micro-credentials coming from the sectors, they score very high on relevance, of course, because they are at the source of what the needs are, and all elements are equally important. They have to be included all, and they have to be of real value. A micro-credential, yeah. So they can't provide the credits. They could be included in the system by recognition of prior learning, so the system to include them, or in collaboration with universities, and making it possible to provide credits there, but that can only be done in collaboration with higher education institutions.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we know these things, and they're still a little problematic. So at the Open University in the UK, we've taken the view that our micro-credentials should have employer endorsement or employer backing. So just about all of the micro-credentials we're producing are done with employer input to ensure that they've got that relevance, but we're awarding the credit. The challenge comes when somebody brings you some learning and say, we would like this to be awarded credit in a micro-credential, and then we have to go through a process which isn't yet well defined. And it's the quality assurance, as you say, George, that makes that quite challenging. Can I switch to quality just for the last 10 minutes or so that we have, and ask my colleagues on the panel whether there are whether we should be worried about quality or not in this space, whether we have sufficient confidence in what we're doing as providers to be able to give us the confidence around the quality of micro-credentials. Janmael, I'll go to you first and then Janneke.
If Janneke wants to start, I have no problem waiting for my turn.
Okay, Janneke.
Yes, no, just very briefly, quality is, if from a recognition perspective, quality is essential in the quality assurance. You can miss maybe something on the workload. I mean, you also need that information, but quality is really essential. So if it's for access to higher education, that would be a key point. But then it's also a bit the question, what's the purpose you're looking for, searching recognition for? That goes a bit back to what we were previously discussing as well. Because when does it become an issue of recognition? You need it for access for something. And we were discussing also about the labor market and employers, the employer, but it's a lot of different employers. So this purpose, I think, is also very important. And this question might be relevant only for in certain situations, and in other situations might not be that relevant or not really create an issue. Let's put it that way. So that's just a brief.
Thank you. Janmael.
Oh yes, indeed, quality is essential. And whether the micro-credential is issued by a university, by an employer, an NGO, quality of the micro-credential is essential. And we think the micro-credential should be subject to both internal and external quality assurance. Of course, the quality assurance must be fit for purpose. If you think of the way micro-credentials are being developed, how short they are, how rapidly developed they are, we know that it's not possible to quality assure every single micro-credential that may be produced by a university, etc. And not each single micro-credential should have to go through the same quality assurance process as a traditional program, because that would be simply impossible for quality assurance agencies to process. And by the time they're done with their assessment, the micro-credential may not even exist anymore. So it must be fit for purpose. We think that there are some key elements that should be looked at when we're talking about quality assurance, which is the quality of the micro-credential itself. And from the European Commission point of view and the definition we put to consultation, we're talking about the certificate, but it should also look into the quality of the learning experience that led to the micro-credential, of course, whether it is a course, a training, or whatever. And we think it's important also to have some kind of feedback of learners and peers when looking at the quality of the micro-credential. We think that that's very important. And for quality assurance, we have the provisions of Annex 4 of the EQF recommendation. We have the ESG that can be used for micro-credentials. We have universities are lucky to have many different instruments that can be used for micro-credentials. Maybe in the future we'll realize they need some kind of adjustment. We don't know, but or maybe they need some guidance in order to be used in more flexible way, or in the way we're not used to use them. And then there are some other quality assurance that can be thought of, like registries of micro-credential offer. They could be labels, all kind of instrument that can be used to build trust about the quality of those microcredentials.
Yeah, thank you. All really important points. Thanks, Anmol. Lynn.
Thanks, and just really, we're in danger of agreeing on everything, but to build out, I suppose, on the learner piece in the quality. So I don't think it is that we should be worried. I think we would all be in agreement that quality is fundamental, but I think we need to interrogate the quality processes that we use because of all those questions around flexibility that Jan Mile outlined so eloquently there. The learner piece, I think we need to look at not just in terms of the feedback, but in the whole design bit. And we need to think a little bit creatively around that piece. So we're not talking about learner engagement in the way that we would for a full program validation, but we do need to acknowledge particularly these learners who would be experienced learners, very professional maybe in their own right. They have a lot to bring to the microcredential development process. So I think we need to think about that learner engagement in all aspects of the quality process, but to think about it in an agile way. So we have access to technologies and tools and different ways of engaging that we can bring to those design processes. And I think could be really instructive, not just for the microcredential quality assurance, but actually maybe change some of our thinking around quality assurance gold standards that we have already that were maybe developed quite a while ago.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm going to, we've got about 5 minutes. Before I sum up or attempt to sum up, I'm going to just fire you each one last question, and I'm going to give you 2 sentences each. Well, I might allow you 3 sentences. So, where do you think microcredentials will be in 10 years' time? George, I'm going to include you in the panel on this, and you've had 30 seconds to think about it. So, where do you think they'll be in 10 years' time?
Are you asking me first, Liz?
Yeah, I'm asking you first.
Well,
me first because we have no time to think.
No, really, I think because, especially because we have been quite at the starting point of these initiatives, also with the short learning programs, and starting the microcredentials with our European MOOC consortium. We strongly believe of a strong position within the educational system, not being part of the mainstream, as it is clearly a need from the market side also for the learners, a need of shorter programs, and also from the market side of responsive and relevant offerings. So I think clearly the need will make it possible that eventually it will be mainstreamed.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go in the order of our speakers. So I'm going to go to Lynn next.
Yeah, well, it'd be no surprise to you that I would imagine that the microcredentials will be embedded in how we do our business. We see really strong appetite from learners, from enterprise for this way of engaging, and it would be my expectation as well as my hope that the lifelong learning journeys therefore are also embedded as part of how we work in higher education. So not alternatives, but as George says, mainstream, entirely embedded into how we think and manage and engage with learners, whether they're part-time or full-time or very part-time, as you might be in the case of microcredentials.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Deborah.
Thank you, Liz. It's always a perilous exercise to project ourselves into the future. Your question made me think back 10 years and almost 10 years. 2012 was the year of the MOOC. And since then, we had predictions that either the MOOC would die a painful death or that it would be the death of the university as we know it. So I wouldn't like to make either of those predictions for microcredentials themselves. And if we look at where MOOCs are today and how they've matured and how they've found their place in this overall ecosystem of higher education, professional development. I think, and so I'm pretty much in agreement with George and Lynn as well, that that they will have matured to find their place in this ecosystem themselves. So not a massive revolution, but this maturing and finding a place and a role, as long as they are meaningful, as George said, relevant to needs of learners, of institutions and of employers.
Thanks, Deborah. Jan Mael.
Yeah, well, I think in 10 years' time, the proposal will have been adopted first, and it will have had some impact on ensuring that microcredentials are indeed embedded in education and training systems in labor markets as well, that the offer is of better quality, more comparable, but also a bit more diverse, and that it doesn't address only big companies' needs in terms of recruitment, but also support more inclusiveness in education and access to education. And I think this is where higher education institutions will have a key role to play with their social mission to support something that may not be seen as so relevant by a private provider, but that is very important for lifelong learning and for inclusiveness of education for all.
Thank you. Thanks. And Janneke, you get the last point.
Yes, thank you. What to add? I can only echo what the previous speaker said, but I would think indeed more mainstream, both MOOCs and universities alive, not a revolution, but an evolution. And I can only hope that all the beautiful opportunities of this for the learner are realized by 10 years, and it's more clear, the picture, and hope that there's clear information about course information, the use of the Bologna tools, and quality assurance of the e-learning. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would attempt to sum up, but fortunately I've run out of time, so I can't. But it's very clear that I was asking the question of people who are already extremely committed to the idea of micro-credentials. So I'd be surprised if you didn't have a positive view of where they were going in the future, but I share that positive view. I think that I'll just go back to those key points that have been raised over and again around recognition, trust, transparency, quality, and relevance. I think those are the messages that we should take away around the work that we need to do. I think there is still work to do. We've taken quite a lot of people with us in a positive direction, but I think we still need to take more people, more governments, more university senior teams with us on this journey. But I've really enjoyed this discussion this morning. I found it incredibly useful. I've made pages of notes, and I hope the audience have found it useful as well. So it remains for me to say thank you to Lynn, to Deborah, to Jan Mael, and to Janneke, and to George, Alessandra, and Stefan for pulling all of this together. And I hope everybody's enjoyed this this week. And I think that's all there is to say. I don't know, George, if you want to make any closing remarks.
Yes, actually, no, first I want to thank all the speakers for contributing today, and the participants, especially for those who have been staying on the whole week. And I think it was really interesting week on microcredentials, and also very timely. I just want to refer to the chat on the two portals that we have launched, one on short learning programs and one on MOOCs for microcredentials. And I think this is a first attempt to really mainstream the provision of microcredentials and short learning programs in combination with the providers and the labor market. So have a look also at these two portals in the chat. Thanks so much, and we will share with you the recordings and the slides by a mailing to all the registered participants soon. Thanks to you all, and I'm quite sure we will be in touch on the same topic soon again.
Thanks, everybody. And
Bye.
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 Everyone.
Bye. Thank you.